morning and welcome to this panel on context and complexity, confronting the challenges of policing in the Pacific. Before we begin, I'd like to pay our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, who are the traditional custodians on which the Australian National University is located, where Jay and I are. It's a special country, which has always been a meeting place and a place to share stories and experiences, so very relevant to this conference. We would also like to pay our respects to the leaders, traditional leaders, past, present, and future here, but also around the region where our panel is located, New Zealand, Fiji, Samoa, and of course, also the rest of the Pacific. I'm Meg Keen. As I've been introduced, I'm the director of the Australia Pacific Security College. The college is an independent educational organization located at the ANU and funded by the Australian government. And similar to the panel that we're going to have today, the college deals with complex security issues across the Pacific Island region, which require collaboration and adaptive approaches. In the Pacific, the leaders through the Boy Declaration on Regional Security have been clear that they support an expanded concept of security, inclusive of traditional security, of course, but also climate, human, resource security. For policing, and as has been evident from this conference, this holistic concept of security makes sense. Already we're seeing in the Pacific expanding forms of and diversifying forms of crime that cross sectors and jurisdictions, are related to digital, financial, and resource exploitation. This isn't really new, but how they manifest themselves are. And so new and ever-evolving challenges require new approaches and partnerships. In the Pacific, the law enforcement agencies, immigration, customs, and policing, have agreed to a declaration of partnership between diverse law enforcement agencies, but then putting those words into action, getting that collaboration can be very challenging. Today, we want to present to you the value and impact of a partnership between the Australia Pacific Security College and the three leading regional law enforcement agencies in the Pacific: the Pacific Islands Chiefs of Police, the Pacific Immigration Development Community, and the Oceania Customs Organization. Before we begin, I'd like you to reflect on the Pacific Island region, which will be familiar to most of you. This region has an area that's about the size of Africa. It's enormous, many times larger than Australia and certainly New Zealand. 98% of it is ocean, the economic exclusion zones of these sovereign countries. So they have to police both land and ocean areas. But that task is very complicated when one considers the very limited resources available to do that. Some countries only have 1 or 2 patrol boats for enormous ocean policing, very limited aerial surveillance. And on land, the police forces face challenges of resources. Think about Papua New Guinea, that only has 7,000 police officers for a population of about 9 million. With these limited resources and increasing transnational crime in the region, one solution is to better network policing. That means cooperation between law enforcement agencies, within countries, but also with communities, and we've heard about that in this conference. Communities are the ears and eyes of the Pacific. And then across the region to deal with very porous borders and increased incoming crime from the community. That's quite complex when you consider this area has 22 countries and territories. And many of the policing and law enforcement agencies have different cultures and different approaches. Faced with evolving criminal activity that often is coming from outside of the region or going, its target is outside of the region, this becomes quite complex. COVID adds another layer of complexity, particularly when you're talking about interjurisdictional collaboration, training, and transnational crime management. So we hope today with this panel, researchers here will have some ideas of the Pacific policing challenges and priorities that our panel members will outline, as well as how they too might bring their expertise to the table and partner with the Pacific practitioner law enforcement agencies to improve the evidence base for law enforcement. Today, we'll be hearing from the Executive Director of the Pacific Islands Chief of Police, Superintendent Glyn Rowland, to give an overview of the context and complexity of Pacific policing. This will be followed by Deputy Director of the Australia Pacific Security College, Jay Caldwell, to discuss how we use scenario exercises to better understand the context, the systems, and possibilities for strengthening. And finally, we'll turn to the heads of the secretariats of the Oceania Customs and Immigration Organizations, Richard Brennan and Ioane Alama, to reflect on how better networked law enforcement helps to achieve greater impact and better integration of law enforcement efforts. So we'll begin with you, Glyn, if you would like to share your insights into the context and complexity of Pacific policing.
Super, thanks, Meg. Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No ingara aho, ko Pennines tomonga, ko Ribble te awa, ko Glyn Rowland toko ingawa, narera, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, bula vinaka. I'm Glyn Rowland, the Executive Director. Delighted to be here. Thank you so much. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Pacific Island Chiefs of Police and a little bit about our environment that we operate in. So the Pacific Island Chiefs of Police, we have 21 member countries representing the 21 police chiefs and commissioners of the Pacific. And we're one of the oldest regional organisations in the Pacific. We're over 50 years old. As you can see by the map, hopefully, oh, there we go, there's the map. The membership covers a vast area of ocean, as Meg's mentioned. And that includes French, with links through to Paris, with New Caledonia, French Polynesia. We have a US influence in the north, with places like Guam. New Zealand, with the domain countries of Niue and the Cook Islands, and a large Australia influence also. Covers about 1/3 of the Earth's surface, which makes it increasingly important for strategic influence and control in the geopolitical context. Most of our member countries are members of the Pacific Island Forum, and over half of the members of the Commonwealth. 9 of our countries are also members of Interpol. So Meg kind of alluded to it, but a big challenge that we have is the differences in systems. So they're not always complementary. So there's different levels of funding, there's different legal frameworks, different levels of operational capability. But despite this, each of these countries have a part to play in Pacific policing, and their impact is immense. A handful have militaries, but most do not. One example of the PICP programme is the Pacific Transnational Crime Network. And this network is made up of member countries sharing information and intelligence across the Pacific regarding transnational organised crime. This is also supported by our colleagues in customs and immigration, working together to share law enforcement information to detect and to deter transnational crime. We have a targeted and collaborative law enforcement response. And again, this network is long established. It's 20 years old next year. The coordination hub of this network sits in Samoa, in what we call the PIDC. One of the biggest complex challenges we face is geography. Trying to police the vast Pacific Ocean, noting it's one of the largest oceans in the world, detecting the movement of illicit drugs on small crafts and vessels in the region remains a significant challenge. And there's a variety of methodologies that we've seen being used to move drugs from vessels at sea, chartered flights, movement through the mail where we rely on our good friends in customs, movement of people where we rely on our good friends in immigration. So we've continued to see detections of illicit drugs in the Pacific, and that's despite the COVID-19 pandemic and the travel restrictions. The economic effects of COVID-19 will no doubt have an impact on us in the Pacific, certainly for our young people, poverty, unemployment, and some of the challenges that we will face. Around drugs in the Pacific, the most illicit drug consumed is actually cannabis and legally alcohol. However, methamphetamine and cocaine are quite often transited, and it's a transit route through from South America through to the lucrative markets of Australia and New Zealand. And what is vital for commercial trade is fisheries. So fisheries play a big part in the Blue Pacific economy, but that's also used by criminal networks as well. So one of the most effective ways to prevent drug harm, as we know, is by working with communities. We know that strong communities prevent crime, and it can also assist in increasing the awareness and understanding of drug harm. Police recognise that we cannot address these issues in isolation, and by working together, we are stronger. Collectively, the PICP, we bring the Pacific Police Commissioners and Chiefs together twice a year to drive regional activities to support the Pacific. And the Commissioners and Chiefs recognise that the Blue Pacific is safer by working together. We've agreed a declaration of partnership with our key partners, Customs and Immigration. And I'm delighted today that Richard and Ioane have joined us for this session. What we will do is outline some of the work that we've done with our academic friends, Jay and Meg from the Pacific Security College, and some of the tabletop exercises we've run. And we in the Pacific really look forward to developing our evidence-based policing approach in the Pacific. Thanks, Meg. I'll hand back to you, good self.
Yeah, thanks for that, Glyn. That's a really interesting overview. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Jay Caldwell, who was part of working with these organizations to co-design a scenario to deal with the new challenges being faced by the Pacific, but also to test current systems, where they're working well and where we needed to work together to adapt them across different sectors, but across the jurisdictions. So Jay, would you like to go from here?
Thank you, Meg. Tēnā koutou, ko Jay Caldwell toku ingoa, no Canberra, Ngunnawal and Ngambri traditional lands, ahu, tēnā koutou katoa. So as we've said, we had the wonderful opportunity of working with our colleagues here in terms of developing an exercise. And we're going to show you a short video on that now just to sort of give you a sense of it, but it goes to the opportunities for future research together. So I'll pass to the director now, and if we can run the video, thank you very much.
The rising tide of transnational crime is one of the most serious security issues facing the Pacific Islands region. In 2018, leaders endorsed the Boyd Declaration prioritizing transnational organized crime as an integral component of the expanded concept of security. That same year, the Oceania Customs Organization, Pacific Immigration Development Community, and Pacific Islands Chiefs of Police signed a declaration of partnership. Together, the organizations represent over 60 national Pacific Islands law enforcement agencies. In 2019, the Secretariats of the Regional Law Enforcement Organizations asked the Australia Pacific Security College to help them build a multi-agency exercise. Their vision was to improve law enforcement cooperation by demonstrating the complexity of transnational crime challenges to police, customs, and immigration agencies in Fiji, Samoa, and the Solomon Islands. The request for the multi-agency exercise across jurisdictions formed the first activity under the Declaration of Partnership.
As part of the ongoing partnership, the three organisations, with the support of the Australia Pacific Security College, participated in 3 virtual workshops in the Pacific Islands of Fiji, Solomon Islands and Samoa. This activity was designed to operationalise this high-level agreement. The Australia Pacific Security College designed and developed case studies based on real-life security challenges. This supported national efforts to develop and strengthen inter-agency cooperation between police, customs and immigration. It also assisted in promoting better understanding and appreciation of each party's role and function for enhancing closer cooperation.
What I was after was an outcome that demonstrated the Boyd Declaration was alive and well, and that multi-agency cooperation at a national border was able to function quite well, but extending that into a multinational cooperation. And I think with this exercise, we clearly saw that evolve. The intelligence flows had to go through the Police Transnational Crime Unit in Samoa because that's how it would work in the real world. We certainly saw that agencies identified their own areas that they needed to improve on and link in with other agencies to make it work a lot better. And from this exercise, I believe that the Boy Declaration is alive and well and can only go from strength to strength.
The Pacific Immigration Development Community, or PIDC as we are known, is a regional organization made up of 21 immigration agencies from the Pacific Island countries and territories. One of the key areas of work for PIDC is strengthening border security and combating transnational crime. An essential part of these operations is ensuring that we work with various law enforcement agencies and collaborate and coordinate to ensure that we can effectively combat criminal networks. The multi-agency tabletop exercise provided a valuable opportunity for our agencies to practice coordinating efforts across several jurisdictions. This scenario was actually realistic in how transnational crimes are both committed in the region and how they can be effectively combated. PIDC welcomes the learnings from this exercise for each of the countries that were involved and will definitely continue to look to partner up in future exercises going forward.
The exercise was conducted on 25th February and 4th March 2021. Each country nominated a task force of representatives from key national arms of law enforcement, which were police, customs and immigration, including a representative from the National Transnational Crime Unit. The exercise scenario addressed the intersections between trafficking of illicit goods, irregular border crossings, smuggling of migrants, and trafficking in persons. Themes included aspects of financial crime, money laundering, and identity fraud. National task forces presented findings and recommendations during the group sessions at the end of each day. These included a number of substantive recommendations for change. The impacts of the exercise have been striking with changed practices at national levels, innovative partnerships, and sharing of skills. The exercise showed us that even with travel restrictions from the COVID-19 pandemic, cross-border and cross-agency exercises are both possible and desirable. Securing the Pacific from a rising threat of transnational crime is a crucial responsibility for law enforcement authorities. The Australia Pacific Security College was honoured to design the first activity under Regional Law Enforcement's Declaration of Partnership.
So this was a capability building exercise, and it was designed to push forward those networking outcomes that, as Glyn mentioned, are needed in the Pacific. And I can tell you it was a lot of fun to be part of. A little bit scary to play in, but a lot of fun to be part of. Unexpectedly, the level of commitment, I guess, and engagement that we got at both a national and a regional level was beyond what we expected. And because as a result of that, we actually generated far more insight. And what we'd like to share with you is some of the clear opportunities for research that come out of that exercise that could actually be the basis of evidence for driving improved policing and law enforcement practice in the Pacific. So there are 4 outcomes that we wanted to point to you that we see as opportunities for future research that the participants actually, so law enforcement officers themselves, identified out of it. The first being that human trafficking is the largest transnational crime knowledge gap in the Pacific. We know it's a problem, but we don't know what the bounds of the issue are. There's some really fundamental research that needs to occur here in terms of understanding what is the current evidence base we have and can use, what are the gaps in that evidence base, and what are the data sets that we need to improve and focus on as a priority. There appears to be an opportunity here, particularly for international comparison work. It's not working off a clean sheet. There is some work going on in this space. So International Organization for Migration is doing some work, and there's been some really fantastic work in an aligned area of modern day slavery in the fisheries industry in recent times. But again, a really important area for work in terms of human trafficking. The second issue is the validity and utility of disruption as a strategy to address transnational crime in a developing economy context. There was a lot of conversation during the activity about that balance between disruption and enforcement and how they go together in partnership. This has incidentally been taken up separately by the Pacific Islands Forum. The peak political body is developing a transnational crime disruption strategy. But if you look at the literature on disruption, it almost exclusively focuses on developed economies, and in particular, Australia, US, and UK. There's a real greenfields opportunity here to get beside Pacific countries as they focus on disruption to understand what are the strengths of the Pacific in taking a disruption focus to transnational crime. Thirdly, information sharing. It always comes out when you run an exercise, and we could probably be here in 100 years and talking about the importance of information sharing. But we want to know, but it's important for Pacific countries to understand what research tells us about barriers and effective approaches to information sharing across law enforcement bodies. We particularly see this as a real opportunity for action research to support that infrastructure of information sharing that Glyn flagged, the Pacific Transnational Crime Network, and as it deepens to allow Pacific countries to have a broader threat view of what's coming at them. And finally, building of partnerships outside of law enforcement is crucial to be effective, particularly in the Pacific, where a range of social institutions take on roles in policing, including threat identification and enforcement functions. And it was wonderful to hear. I think there is again an opportunity here for international comparison. We heard about Te Pai Oranga across the conference, and it's another example that could be drawn into the Pacific. There obviously are a range of other research opportunities in the Pacific, but these came out of this working together and networking. I just build on what Professor Keen said at the start about the importance of collaboration in the Pacific. You've got here in the regional law enforcement agencies avenues to provide a legitimate way and legitimate pathway and access into the Pacific, and also who can follow through as active partners in the implementation of research outcomes. Back to you, Professor Keen.
Thanks, Jay. And I think that's a real demonstration of the importance of experimenting. And when you do scenarios, it is a fail-safe environment. You can try things from overseas, you can experiment, you can try new networks, new ways of sharing information, which was all done in the scenario, and figure out what works, what you need to improve on. And when you need to expand the partnerships, including, as we might hear about in a moment, beyond just the law enforcement agencies to include other actors. And then again, also different ways of sharing information digitally, but you also saw there was a lot of mapping going on, and the digital environment allows us to map together and to analyze crime scenes and flows of criminal activity. So I'd like to now go to Richard Brennan, who is the head of the OSHA Customs Organization Secretariat, to reflect on the experience and the learning that organization and his colleagues had from rolling up their sleeves and getting down and giving it a try. Richard?
Thank you, Professor, for this opportunity, and thank you, Jay, for that video. I think it highlighted just what a collaborative approach can bring to the fore. And essentially in our domain, it's about focusing on criminality at the border, and the border actually extends into the domestic sector. And in that domestic sector, we need a number of operators. We do need immigrations, and we do need police and a task force approach on a lot of things that come across the border. And I think that will be a continuing element moving forward. Resources can be shared during a joint operation, and because we're resource scarce in the Pacific, not all agencies may have what they need within their own setup to do the job. So that sharing arrangement really stands out as a key element. And the knowledge that is learnt from the participants, it's shared and it's taken back into that particular participant's organisation. And as more officers are exposed to these learnings, you start to expand that knowledge within a particular organisation. And that is capacity building 101. It's that knowledge centre that builds the organisation towards the future. Standard operating procedures evolve out of these sort of exercises. And certainly we saw in day one a key component, the Immigration Department in One Nation recognised they weren't tapped into what they needed to be tapped into. That happened within the first 15 minutes of commencing the exercise. They resolved that post-exercise, and it was a brilliant outcome, I think, probably one of the key outcomes from day one. We were able to see the gaps and close them down operationally. Also shared costs. When you're working in a joint activity, the Pacific Island budgets, they're pretty tight, particularly now with COVID. So joint activities can share that cost factor. But most importantly, it establishes trust in the working group. People working together collectively, they learn to trust each other and each other's agencies. When it's in an exercise, it's readily transferable with the operatives into their actual work environment in the real world. So they can pick up the phone and ask someone they trust in another agency, what about this crook? How do we tackle this issue? And they're going to feel very comfortable in doing that. That building of trust is so important to break down some of the silo barriers that are now becoming outdated, well and truly. And as those people evolve through their own organisations, that trust goes up through the ranks at the higher levels, and it only benefits future joint activity. And we saw some really, really good results in a couple of areas in the real life that actually have now flown from that exercise. So for us, trust essentially opens up information sharing. And that is absolutely critical to enforcing criminality within the Pacific moving forward. But it also looks at the societal aspects. The people will work out who's involved, who needs help, and with their own villages at the personal level, they can start drawing the people that are heading towards criminality back from it. And I think in the context of the forum you're in at the moment, that's really important. So I look forward to continuing our partnership with the PIDC and the PICP. It's an incredible partnership and it is delivering results. And our 23 members in the Pacific are really keen to have exercises put into their own backyards, but extending that into actual real operations moving forward. So thank you, Professor, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Richard, for those insights. Ioane, would you like to just add some added thoughts from the Pacific Immigration Development Community's perspective and what they got out of the exercise?
Thank you, Meg. So first of all, I'd like to commend all the presentations made and also the presentation made by Richard. We echo the comments that Richard made. There were a lot of very strong learnings, and I guess there were learnings that immigration, police, and customs took, and there were also learnings that at the national level, each of the agencies took away. And for example, the Secretariat, the PIDC Secretariat is hosted in Apia, Samoa. And from the Samoan perspective, the law enforcement agencies that came here identified that they needed to basically look at improving their coordination. So as a result of their discussions here, they've now formed a working group of sorts, and they're looking at developing a cabinet paper to actually formalize this relationship. That was all came out of these discussions. I'm very cognizant of time, so my last comment that I'd like to say is, one thing that I've noticed that working in the region over the last 10 years, when we're talking about interagency activities, there's a real need to maintain a knowledge base. Sometimes you get really good police commissioners, immigration directors, and customs controllers who are ready to work together. For some reason, one of them or the coordinator is no longer with the group, and a new officer comes in, and then we see this interagency cooperation fall over. So it's really important, and I think just to end on, I recall that there was a program that New Zealand did in the early 2000s introducing combined law agency groups across the Pacific. They were almost the forerunner of the transnational crime units, but we noticed that many times, and they had formal documentation, MOUs signed between all of the organizations, but we noticed time and again, once the main drivers were no longer part of the grouping, often the next officer coming in, whoever the secretariat was for the national grouping, wouldn't keep up the activities and would see their activities slide away. So I think one of the main things I want to sort of highlight is the need to keep that corporate knowledge, not only within police, customs, immigration, but for interagency work. At least one of those agencies need to keep going back to the joint MOU for cooperation and saying, if you're a new immigration director, this is what we've signed already. This is what you need to start doing. Thank you very much, Meg.
Thanks, Ioane. And I think that's really important with these learning and participatory action research designs is they're iterative. They don't sort of have a set and forget. You do it once, it's over. And I know in our own case, we're committed to rerunning the scenario exercises and also evolving them each year so that you continually keep pushing the system to see where its strengths and weaknesses are, but you keep involving the new actors, whoever they may be, often new agencies, just to see how you're coming together and how effective you can be. What we want to do now is have an opportunity for dialogue. So we do want to go to a question period. For the first time in this conference, we have a number, I think, of participants. I don't know what happened in detail, what happened in the past, but certainly this time we have a number of Pacific Island participants from law enforcement agencies. And we thought it would also be informative to involve them in this Q&A to understand the kind of pressures and priorities they're under and what issues are important to them. Because of internet connectivity challenges, we have pre-recorded these questions so that we could be sure that people from around the region, Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, could be part of this discussion. So I would now ask our conference organizers to play those questions, and then we'll go to the panel for some responses. Thank you.
Malolele and good morning. I'm Celosia Sardini. I'm here with Tonga Police DCU family. And the question you would like to ask, what are the Pacific government doing to support the challenge of organized crime? Malo Obito.
Thank you. I think we're back. So we'll just quickly go maybe to the panel for a quick response, and then we'll go to the next question. I think I might start with you, Glyn, this question of dealing with organized crime that keeps changing, keeps evolving, and slips across the borders all the time. What are we doing in the Pacific about that?
Yeah, so I mean, specifically around the governments, Meg. So PIPS, Jay alluded to it earlier, Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, which is the regional body that brings the prime ministers together. They're looking at a transnational organised crime framework. So there's been work done in the past, and Ioane was part of that when he worked for PIPS, but there's now a refresh where the governments are looking around what their next steps are. And from us, from a policing perspective, that's really exciting because there's a couple of things that there is opportunity to do. And certainly from our perspective, one would be around legislation, around what legislative changes need to be made. And then secondly, around prevention opportunities. You know, we talk about communities, having that dialogue with the communities and working with communities, make communities safer, but what the communities need. And ultimately, the police haven't always got the answer to everything. It's got to come from the wider, which is part of where the government comes in. So from a regional perspective, there is a lot happening, but obviously it's small chunks, and it's an issue that's been there for an awful long time. So we're not going to say we're going to solve it overnight, but there is work in place. Thanks, Meg.
Richard, Ioane, do you want to talk about how your organizations feed into that response to organized crime and strengthen it? Either one of you want to make a quick comment on that?
Yep. Thank you, Meg. Very quickly. Yes, we are doing work, each in their own space, I guess. So I do know that across the region we're promoting the universal sign up to the international legal frameworks around combating transnational organized crime, and the Palermo Convention, of course. We're also looking at supporting members develop the necessary frameworks. So, for example, I know that Immigration and Customs have been providing support through PIDC and, of course, Richard through OCO, supporting members to develop their immigration and customs legislation, which also includes legal provisions that combat organized crime. So a lot of the provisions are also covered in that legislation. So in addition to that, there's been a number, for example, PIDC has undertaken quite a bit of research to develop regional standards. So we've developed regional standards and we've developed model SOPs, model legislation, best practice for immigration primary line officers. And a key component of this entire work is that identifying how we can strengthen the activities of our officers, the legal provisions on how to combat areas of organized crime. And last but not least, I know there's a significant capacity building component by all of our three organizations, including the Pacific Transnational Crime Coordination Center. They do a lot of capacity building. So just to give you a flavor, in recent past, through the Australian Border Force and also through Immigration New Zealand, we provided training on vessel search, document examination at the border, facial recognition, and also fundamentals of border control. Sorry, I did say last but not least, but the very last one is we've also set up academic trainings at partnering with the University of the South Pacific or other universities to actually set up academic programs for our officers. So I know the PICP have worked to establish the Bachelors of Policing in Fiji, and we've actually also established PIDC has established with the University of South Pacific a online postgraduate diploma on border control. So we're trying. We need more resources, but we're trying. That's what we've got. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Richard, can I put you on the spot and say, just give me one or two where the gaps are? We've heard about where things are strong or how we're strengthening organized crime, but where do you see one or two places where there's a bit of a hole and therefore that might draw in some of the research community to think more about that?
I think it's definitely the intelligence flow. It's not getting where it needs to get to when it needs to get to. I mentioned earlier a silo approach. We do have to break down these silos. So we've got a really good system in play at the moment, and people just need to adopt it and to make sure that they're sending all of their info through to the Police Transnational Coordination Centre in Samoa through their own TCUs, the transnational crime units. And that'll get the regional picture developing, because that little group in Samoa is really the eyes and ears of the Pacific when it comes to law enforcement. They are seeing those criminal links that form the syndicates, and they can see it throughout the region. They can also see it nationally if they're getting the right information. So the intelligence flow is definitely a problem. We've developed the Small Craft app, which is tracking all the yachts through the Pacific from point to point. I think that information needs to get to the PTCCC, and we're working on that. We've set up the GRIDS platform with the UN ODC people, so we're looking at the movement of synthetics into the Pacific. We need to start to identify when we capture something through the post or at the border in the maritime or air cargo, and make sure that's put into that system, so that then we can start to flag through our technology processes the high-risk practices, the entities that are involved, the hotspots that we know of. So that sort of evolution has to come in order to close down some of those gaps. It's a work in progress. It's not going to happen overnight. We have a number of agencies that do not have the databases that we need them to have. So donor funding comes into that to help support that build-up. But all of this is part of closing down the gaps. We know the issues, but because we're all regional bodies, we don't really have an imprimatum at a national level. We have to work through a diplomatic process to get there, and that takes time. So I hope that answered your question, Meg.
That's great. That's really valuable. Could we go to the next? Actually, we could probably do the next two questions and then we'll move around the panel to make sure we answer both of them. That might be the more efficient way to go given time constraints. So if I could ask the conference organizers to just play the next two questions that are from Samoa and Fiji, and then we'll continue on the discussion with the panel members. Thank you.
All right, talofa and greetings from Samoa. My name is Paul Akui. I am currently working as the team leader for the Policy Development and Monitoring Unit under the Immigration Division at the Ministry of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. So my question is, what work has been done to try and deconflict the work of all the different agencies?
Bula, my name is Lisa Kubombola Naiwalurua, and I am the Principal Customs Officer at the Air Cargo Control Unit at Fiji Revenue and Customs. I've been with Customs for 6 years, and prior to joining Customs, I was working with the Fiji Financial Intelligence Unit. The law enforcement group desktop exercise was coordinated in Fiji, Samoa, and Solomon Islands with representatives from Police, Customs, and Immigration Department. The aim of the exercise was to see agencies working together at a national level and also at a regional level to combat transnational crime. So the exercise also supported our objectives to implement the coordinated border management strategy in our respective countries. What do you think are the major benefits of working together? Collaboration and cooperation is the key to combating transnational crime for law enforcement agencies in any region.
Right, thanks. So we'll start with the first one from Paul in Samoa, which is really going to that issue of deconflicting. And things that we talked about is some of the agencies can have different principles, approaches, priorities, and you got to work that through in a time-constrained environment where you've got to work fast and you've got to move the information around. So I might start with you, Richard, on just reflecting about that issue of deconflicting the work of all the different agencies.
Thank you for that question. We operate at a regional level and we work with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat a lot, but we feed in what our partner agencies are telling us are the issues and what our own membership tells us. And that helps formulate a plan of attack, a working plan for us annually. But what we're doing right now with our partnership agreement is we're in constant contact with PIDC and PICP to make sure we're not doubling up, to make sure that we are getting the best value for the donor's dollar, because they're very keen on getting blood out of a stone, and we do need to get those outputs that we promise them. And so it's through that cooperation and understanding of what the landscape is that we're able to deconflict and we're able to work together in partnership. At least that's my take on it.
Yeah.
Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. I thought I might ask Jay, who was part of the designing of this project. One of the issues here is you have sovereign countries. They're in charge of their borders. They have their own governance. And so when you're designing scenarios that push and test the system, how are you deconflicting possibly different priorities of the countries involved and the issues they want to deal with or the approaches they want to take?
Well, there's two things. One is lots of conversations so that you've actually got a good sense of it in terms of both the priorities across those agencies and also the interests that are in play. And I guess one of the things that we really appreciated in the design of this approach is working with the regional agencies. It helped us to have a pathway to understand some of those interests that were in play so we could actually manage some of those sensitivities, but also in a way that kind of allowed the cooperation issues to come to the fore. But you're right, in the end, it is about national coordination. And I think the point Ioane made in Samoa about the country is actually taking the opportunity to actively reflect on what works and what do I want to see improved in future, and how am I going to establish the mechanisms. Actually get a mechanism that works in terms of coordinating is actually the key. So while we can set it up in terms of a conversation within the context of the exercise, the long-term impacts in terms of better coordination come through those mechanisms that are created and strengthened. As Ioane said in Samoa, I think Richard said as well in the example in terms of transnational crime units, which are the connection, that link between the national and the regional, those being strengthened out of the exercise, people taking the opportunity to kind of learn about the coordination and think about what it means for themselves. Thank you, Meg.
Right. Glyn, the chiefs of police are set up just for that very purpose. I would have thought of deconflicting across the forces, but also with those agencies that the force have to work with. So I would be interested in some of your views on when the conflicts arise and how you deal with them.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I think the main key is communication, and communication at all different levels. And one thing I've learned while I've been in this role is 21 police commissioners and chiefs, but they all have a boss, they have a minister. So there's different layers. So there's a regional layer and then there's the national layer. And I think the most important thing is communication. So the Pacific Island Chiefs of Police, we have a strategic plan. And in them is some activities that we have discussed with the commissioners. And one of them that we've asked of them is that they meet regularly with their equivalents in immigration and customs. They meet with the CEOs to get that understanding around what their pressures are and look for real opportunities to work together. Because ultimately, the real power is when you work together. You understand each other. You can share the success when you have a success, and working together at a national level or a regional level, no matter what that is, by doing that and combining the resources. And I think earlier on in one of the discussions here at the conference, they discussed about efficiencies and doing things as efficient as possible. That's a big seller to governments when you've got immigration, customs and police working together effectively, not duplicating. And actually that's working smarter. So it's how that dialogue goes. But I think it comes back to communication, and then working together. And then if you can, celebrate the success. I think that's really important. Thanks, Meg.
Have a cup of tea, eh? I want to jump now to Ioane with the third question, just to make sure we covered them all off, about the benefits of working together. And I think this is particularly relevant to your organization with immigration, because it might have been police and customs are used to working together on the boardings. Immigrations, movement of people, and all the complexity of that is probably an interesting one, and how you find yourself working with these other law enforcement agency, how that's gone and what's been useful for you, and maybe even what you think everyone still needs to work on, Ioane.
Thank you, Meg. So I guess going through that, I guess it's come very clearly from Pacific Island forum leaders that we need to avoid duplication so that we can maximize the use of resources. And at the end of the day, there's a Samoan saying that it takes more than one coconut to make a good bowl of coconut cream. And right now, I think if you look at it, each of the agencies and each of the organizations have got their own little bit of resources that they can bring to the table. But at the end of the day, if you want to create something that is sustainable, effective, and ticks all the boxes in terms of taking care of all the needs, then you really need to work together and collaborate. And I think that's something that's well received and well looked upon in the law enforcement space. So for us, classic example, the introduction of the combined law agency group type of thinking, where you can have a high level CLAG for the directors and the police commissioners, an operational CLAG for the managers to talk about specific activities, and then interagency tactical CLAGs that can actually focus on specific interventions. And of course, if you look at the transnational crime units, you could almost say these are a type of CLAG. And if we can just take that approach, when we've got a problem, rather than trying to approach it on our own, look at the stakeholders around us, get them all together in the room, and then let's discuss how we can approach this. It might be a national issue or it might be a regional issue, but you need to get all the players in the room so they can discuss what they can bring. I guess that's the main thing I wanted to say. That's the benefit from working together. And in terms of deconflicting, I think, it's essential that we don't duplicate each other's activities. And I'll tell you now, my experience from working in the region, no matter how well you plan something. Sorry, before I say that, I'd like to agree with what Glyn said about planning together and celebrating together. Very essential to build a trust. But one of the most key things that I can say after working in the region for over 15 years is you need to get the right people. I've seen a number of law enforcement projects and activities fall over because someone was selected to that. So it might not be a people person, for example. And if you send them to another country who is only meeting with you on a voluntary basis, if you insult them or rub them the wrong way, they're not going to come to the second meeting. So what I'm trying to say is you need the right people who've got the right thought process, the right sort of cultural background and the right objectives to try and engage with each other. And that's how you establish that trust in the relationships.
Fantastic. Richard, would you like to have just a final word on that last question before we wrap up here? I'm just watching how we're going.
Working together builds trust. And that's the end of my statement there, Professor. It just builds trust.
Which means we've got a few minutes. Jay, I wondered if you wanted to talk about, with this value of working together, thinking about how you go forward to keep expanding and reinforcing that working together side of things with these kind of scenario exercises, and possibly the role of this research.
Indeed. Well, I think one of the things that struck us when we first got into this conversation, Meg, was we had 3 leaders in these organisations who actually had vision for the future, and they actually wanted to build architecture. So as we've talked about here, we've got really small law enforcement services that are doing a really wonderful job for their country, trying to work at both a national level and also push in terms of their support at a regional level. But they need the architecture around them to actually be able to support that. And things like exercises, things that institutionalize relationships and that opportunity for connection and conversation is what's needed to keep things going. It goes back to Ioane's point about having the right people and having also being able to pass over that institutional knowledge. So we've talked about and started to plan and scheme in terms of thoughts for doing sort of similar types of law enforcement exercising next year to make it sort of start to be a bit of an annual building block. And then what can then you build on that institutionalizes the opportunity for relationship and connection together. It's been a really amazing experience to this point. It does take a while to get things to land, like Richard said, when we're working all together. But I think it's a real credit to the Declaration of Partnership and what the organisations have brought together, that they actually landed this exercise so successfully, and it's seen such impact at a national level as a result.
Yeah. And I think that's important, that it didn't stop at the scenario exercise. There were actually changes to the networking, the institutional arrangements, and indeed who was being consulted and brought into the network was also critically looked at. And I know we had in some of the countries thinking about how to involve community groups more effectively, the women's groups, the church groups, how to harness the new technologies that are rapidly developing, the silver lining of COVID, of this ability to work digitally really effectively together. I think some of our speakers have talked about trying to find shared purpose, principles, and approaches, and you can really only do that through the doing and expose where the differences are, and then how you can think about resolving those, and accepting that there are power differentials both between countries, agencies, etc., and we've got to expose those and think about how we effectively deal with them. So I know we have a commitment, and the 3 agencies we worked with have a strong commitment to keep evolving these processes, evolving the kind of relationships and strengthening them, and certainly have an interest in research partnerships with all of you around the table in this conference to think critically about how do you improve the system and how research can contribute to that improvement. So from all of us, I'd like to thank you, allow you time to get your second coffee or your lunch. And so I'd also like to thank all of those who were on the panel, Jay Caldwell, Richard Brennan, Glyn, Rowland, and Ioane Alama. Thank you very much. It's been fantastic working with you, and we look forward to keep working together in the future.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Megan. Before you go, we've just had a question come in for one of the panelists, actually. So I'd just like to put that, if that's okay, Meg. It is from Jonathan Totman, and I think it's to Ioane, but feel free to open up if that's okay, Meg. What is the role of civil society and INGOs in helping both operationally investigations and strategically legitimacy, anthropogenic crimes in helping to tackle transnational organised crime?
Absolutely. Ioane, do you want to start off? Because this did come out a little bit in the scenario as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the question. I was praying it would be for someone else, but so look, I think civil society plays a significant role in combating crime. If you're looking at it in terms of partnerships, they actually play an important role in terms of providing information and raising awareness. Unfortunately, traditionally, we in the Pacific Islands, and I'm sure this has also happened in many of the Western nations, civil society haven't always been viewed through a positive lens. A lot of times they've been viewed almost similar to media. You know, they're trying to get us sometimes. And again, for some of the advocacy groups, it's their job to raise awareness about issues. But just to give you an example of something, we had a regional workshop with UNODC back in, I think, 2013, 2014. And we invited police officers, customs immigration officers, and one civil society member from all the Pacific Island countries to come to Suva when I was with the forum. And then we started, it was about human trafficking. When we discussed human trafficking, we got so much more information from civil society than we did from the law enforcement officers. So obviously there's a wealth of knowledge there. Obviously they have a very important role to play, especially in terms of their role in terms of taking care of potential victims of organized crime and transnational crime. But there needs to be better ways to enhance the partnership between law enforcement and civil society, so that so they're not viewed as, you know, a group who are trying to get the law enforcers. You know, basically, we can use them, work in partnership with them. We just have to find a way to balance it so that everyone gets to benefit, and especially not only the law enforcement, not only the civil society, but also the victims themselves. I think, I'm not sure if there's anything else that was asked about that question, but I hope that sort of provides an answer. Thank you. Thank you, Ioane.
I wonder if Glyn, if we have 1 minute, if Glyn or Jay wants to talk about it. I think it was in Fiji, they decided through the scenario exercise that they would have to involve the Ministry of Women in order to get to women's group who could give those insights into when a fast happening crime was happening and what was going on the ground. I think that came out of one of the exercises. I think it was Fiji. Was that right, Glyn, Jay?
There was, particularly in terms of Samoa using the Ministry of Women as a connection to the village and the community in terms of managing migration issues in a way that was consistent with the strengths of the community. So rather than them having to come in and check about new people coming in and integration and overstayers, they were actually using the strengths of the community and appropriate ways to manage it. So that was a direct result coming out of the exercise. Again, Samoa, which is a really strong community, has some really great practices in terms of engaging community and law enforcement, still saw further opportunities for the community to play a strong role. Glyn?
Yeah, just generally on that point, Jay, I mean, it comes back to policing with communities. You know, they're the eyes and ears, they're in the community. And actually, quite often, police, believe it or not, they're blind to a lot of things that are happening within communities. So NGOs and community groups do play an integral part. It's just where they fit into the bigger picture, but definitely for the building the picture around the problem, definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks,
thank
Meg.
you all. Thank you all. Thank you, Meg, for your active facilitation in this session. We really do appreciate it. And to your panel, Superintendent Glyn, Rowland, Richard Brennan, Jay Caldwell, and Ioane Alama, thank you all very much.